on BBC Radio 5 Sports Extra.
A week off after a wet and soggy Canada, Formula One pitches up in Barcelona at the Circuit de Catalunya, a track that every driver knows like the back of their hand, and the beginning of an intense triple header, and lots of questions to still be answered. Will Red Bull resume dominance? Is there really a multi-team fight on our hands? And what about off-track? The driver market continues to rumble on, and with everyone waiting on Carlos Sainz to announce his future, so too for Adrian Newey to settle on which team receives his services for next year and beyond. Well, we're just moments away from free practice one, where hopefully we'll begin to get a few of those questions answered. My name's Harry Benjamin, and guiding you through all of the coverage alongside myself is former F1 mechanic Mark Priestley and the BBC's F1 correspondent Andrew Benson. Mark, as I said, this is a track that pretty much every driver, every team knows so well due to the sheer amount of testing that's taken place here on top of the race over the last few years. But is it a good track? Do we like coming here? Is it good for racing?
Well, that very final question there is the one that everyone wants to know the answer to. Is it good for racing? Traditionally, not really, if we're really honest about this. It is a great track for lots of things, and one of the things I'm most looking forward to this weekend is finding out where everybody really sits, because for that it's great. It's got a reasonable variation of corners. It's a traditional type track as opposed to the street tracks of Monaco, obviously Montreal, quite unique in terms of the way that it's laid out and what therefore it demands of the car. So with all the improvements we've seen coming from the likes of McLaren and Ferrari up against that dominant Red Bull from the start of the year, this could be the moment we really find out exactly where everyone really sits.
Yeah, I mean, Andrew, in terms of that on-track performance then, this seems like it's going to be the circuit that reveals a bit more where we are, I suppose, in terms of how Red Bull and Max Verstappen sit at the moment. What are your feelings about the competitive order?
Well, first of all, it's always been said that Barcelona is a sort of ultimate arbiter of Formula 1 car performance. The drivers yesterday were saying actually things have changed a bit. The balance of tracks across the season has changed. There's a lot more street circuits than there used to be, a lot more tracks with slower corners, short duration corners, whereas Barcelona's famous for these medium and high speed long duration corners, which is why it was always considered to be a good test of a car's aerodynamics. It remains that, excuse me, that's not necessarily the same as it being a good arbiter of how a car's going to perform over the entirety of the season. Having said that, we have got a series of tracks coming up now. Barcelona, first of all, followed by Austria, Silverstone, Hungary, Spa, Zandvoort after the summer break, which are all similar type of characteristics of tracks, faster tracks, European classic road circuits, if you like. So I think what it will do, bearing in mind, with the caveat that everyone brings updates quite regularly, and there are a lot of updates this weekend, I think it will give us a sense of how things might shape up over the next few races.
Well, just a few moments then away from getting the green light at the end of the pit lane to signal the beginning of free practice one. Let's bring you up to date with how the constructors and drivers standings sit. In the drivers, with the win in Canada, Max Verstappen now has 194 points. That's a 56-point gap over Charles Leclerc in second. Then it's Lando Norris in third, ahead of Sainz. Sergio Perez in the second Red Bull, now down to fifth in the drivers. Over in the Constructors' Championship, it's still Red Bull who maintain a 49-point lead with 301 points to their name, ahead of Ferrari. McLaren, Mercedes and Aston Martin make up the top five. Then it's RB heading up that second part of the Constructors' Championship. Then it's Haas, Alpine, courtesy of a double points finish last time out in Canada, now go back ahead of Williams, who are only ahead of Sauber, who are 10th and last, the only team yet to get off the mark. 0 points to their name. And actually, well, Mark, it was 0 points last time out for Ferrari. Double DNF for them. Do we think Canada was a bit of an outlier for them? Because, of course, the qualifying Canada, both outside of the top 10 as well, they need to bounce back quite strongly here.
Yeah, they do. And I kind of think they will. I hope it was an outlier, because what we've actually seen is some real good progression from Ferrari, like we've seen to some extent from McLaren. Slightly different in terms of the way the two teams have approached it, but definitely getting closer to the front, which is what every Formula One fan wants to see. So I think we're going to see a slightly more general viewpoint of where everyone sits here. And Andrew's right. it is going to be a real indicator of what we might see over the coming rounds.
Well, there is already a gaggle of cars waiting at the end of the pit lane for that green light to head out onto this circuit. 4.6 kilometres, just over 2.8 miles, 9 turns to the right, 6 to the left, as it is Valtteri Bottas in the fluoro green Sauber that is the first car out on track, followed by one of the Aston Martins. That's Fernando Alonso, one of the home heroes on the track, along with Carlos Sainz, who has yet to make his way out. But 2 Spanish drivers on home soil, cheered on by the absolutely full grandstands already for a Friday at this circuit, which of course we're going to see drop off the calendar, we think, in a couple of years. Madrid scheduled to come onto the calendar from 2026 onwards. I mean, Madrid's a pretty nice place as well to go to, I'm sure, Mark, but this is such a staple, and I suppose it goes back to what Andrew was saying about how these more traditional European circuits are becoming less and less of a thing.
Yeah, and I hope it doesn't become a trend that grows too much, because one thing, I don't mind a street track on the circuit. I don't mind going to places like Vegas. I don't mind Miami. You know, I actually don't even mind Monaco. But as long as we have a good mix across the season, one of the things that the last few rounds has really highlighted is that with such a variety in terms of circuits and therefore the demands they place on the cars and teams, we get a slightly more likely to get a mix of results, and we've seen that recently. So when you've got a team that might struggle at some circuits to balance its characteristics, you go somewhere like Montreal, which has a very small window, if you like, in terms of what it demands from the car, then you can tailor your car towards that. It can balance out performance. So I hope we keep the mix. And one thing we're not going to see diminish from the calendar, I'm sure, in terms of Spain's involvement, is any enthusiasm from the fans. We've got Fernando Alonso still here for a few more years. Carlos Sainz, we're sure about to announce a long-term deal too. So there's going to be a Spanish contingent on this grid for some time to come. Well,
as I'll just quickly do a sync for those who wish for it. It's coming at you now. 57 minutes and 54, 53 seconds remain of free practice 1. Well, you mentioned Carlos Sainz might be on the brink of an announcement. He said in the build-up to this weekend that he's ready to make a decision. Where is that decision going to go, Andrew? Well,
he didn't say he'd made it, did he? He said he needed to make it.
It's almost like he's giving himself the hurry up.
Yeah, exactly. That was basically what it was. He was saying he's trying to concentrate on the races, and because he knows he's got chances of winning them quite often. But he hasn't made the decision between Williams and Sauber, which is going to become Audi in 2026. That's his choice, basically. Both of which are obviously going to be a bit of a drop for him after being at Ferrari for the last few years and McLaren before that. Does seem a little bit harsh on Carlos Sainz, I have to say, competitiveness wise. And we were discussing on the podcast yesterday, really don't understand why Red Bull didn't sign him instead of Sergio Perez, but there you go, they didn't.
I think we do know why they didn't sign him,
We do know why, yes. It's to keep Max happy, isn't it?
Yeah.
So which is ironic because Max might be about to leave anyway at the end of 2025. So I expect I don't know which one he's going to go to. I think you can make a case for both of those teams in the short term. You would think in the long term, maybe Audi would be a better bet because they're a major manufacturer, but in Formula One there's a bit of scepticism about the Audi project and whether it will actually turn out to be as good as Audi hope it will be.
Do you think Mark Sainz is looking for a long term, or does he want something that's more short term that allows him to showcase still what he's got, stay in Formula One, and then hopefully leapfrog back into a more established front running team if an opportunity arises within the next couple of years?
Well, I think that the long-term problem that anyone on this grid has got, and Carlos highlighted it himself in the press conference, was that no one can possibly tell what's going to happen in 2026. Of course, you can look to sort of the recent form book and you can say, well, perhaps the bigger teams who might be slightly better resourced in terms of their facilities, they've already got, great people in there with vast experience. So you're probably going to look at the bigger teams and say, they're more likely to do a better job in a major rule set that we've got coming. But there's actually nothing really to say that another team from further back down the grid might do a better job. It's such a vast, sweeping set of changes to both power unit and chassis that it's really difficult, impossible even, to predict who's going to come out on top. So he's basing at least part of his decision on what chances he might have next year in 2025, which is a tough thing between those two teams that Andrew mentioned.
It is. It's tricky. I mean, the situation is basically there's the DRS problem on one of the RBs there. I couldn't quite tell which one.
Tsunoda.
Is flopping about in the way that the Red Bull one used to do a couple of years ago from time to time. Anyway, I think the difficulty is that, so at the moment Williams are definitely in better shape than Sauber, but not that much better shape than Sauber, even if Sauber are having a very, very difficult season. Williams also not having a great season, even if they are a bit ahead of Sauber. Then you've got 2026 as the question, because presumably he's not going to sign just a one-year contract, because actually the problem that he's got is that the top teams are basically locked in with the question mark about Verstappen's future. The top teams are basically locked into their drivers for quite some time now. Charles Leclerc and Lewis Hamilton got multi-year contracts at Ferrari starting from next year. George Russell's Mercedes till the end of 25. You've got Alonso and Stroll obviously committed to Aston Martin till the end of 2026. Not that they're really a top team anymore this year. McLaren are very committed to Norris and Piastri. So there are not a lot of openings for Sainz. So if he's got to judge what's the most competitive team next year, a hard decision to make, I think, although you'd probably bet on Williams, I think, on the basis of this year so far. But then 26, Williams will have a Mercedes engine, and I think we can be pretty certain the Mercedes engine will be competitive, at least in 26 when Formula 1 introduces these new engine regulations. I don't think you could say the same about Audi with as much confidence, just because they're so new. And obviously Sauber is a team that, which is what Audi is going to become, which is what's going to become Audi. They're a team that have struggled fundamentally to ever be competitive. The only time they've really ever had a front-running car was actually when they were in a very similar situation to what they're going to be, which is when BMW owned them in 2008, when they were actual title contenders, and then they made some very, very ill-advised management decisions that year, and in the hope that they'd be competitive in 2009, and then weren't. So maybe Audi can turn that team around, but you wouldn't expect it to happen that quickly.
And there was a very amusing point in the press conference yesterday where Tom Clarkson asked Kevin Magnussen, what is the cork in the bottle when it comes to drivers signing their contracts for next year and beyond? To which Kevin Magnussen just pointed and said, well, he is pointing at Carlos Sainz, because Sainz's future is going to dictate the future of a lot of other drivers further down the field, not to mention Kevin Magnussen, Valtteri Bottas. Where does he go? Esteban Ocon is on the market and in the hunt for a drive. There are so many other pieces of the puzzle that will fall in place, but we need Sainz to move first.
Well, plus we've got a number of young drivers who are currently not in Formula One, really knocking on the door with a credible shout to take a place. Kimi Antonelli, often been talked about at Mercedes. I think there's a very high chance he'll end up in that Mercedes seat. There's Jack Doohan, potentially on his way into Alpine to fill the vacant Ocon seat. There's Ollie Behrman, of course, who you know how good he is. So the future talent coming in is almost making a really good case, which is actually making it quite difficult for the likes of Magnussen and Bottas, who are having to hang on and wait for Carlos Sainz. So it's actually a tricky driver market right now.
Yeah, basically we're looking at a situation where we're expecting Antonelli, who's in F2 at the moment in his first season, to get the second Mercedes seat alongside George Russell. We're expecting Ollie Behrman to get one of the Haas seats. That leaves one Williams seat, two Sauber seats, and one Haas seat basically that are still left over. And also the RB, the second RB after Tsunoda was confirmed in Canada last weekend. And there's a bunch of drivers, Bottas, Ocon, Magnussen, who are all looking for a seat, and some of them are going to miss out. So the question then becomes, is Ocon or Bottas more appealing to Williams, for example, or Sauber, when Sainz turns one of those two down? Here's Sainz's radio.
No power.
No power, according to Carlos Sainz on the radio. He's just making his way through the the double right-handers now, turn 13 and then 14 flat out. He doesn't come into the pits though, so he's staying out and going again.
Power.
And just to finish the point, there's also Alpine, of course, where there's two seats potentially available after they said that Ocon was definitely not staying before the Canadian race 2 weeks ago. They haven't talked about Gasly. It looks like Pierre Gasly, I think, will probably stay, but even that's not certain at this stage. There's more
multifunction strat position 1, multifunction strat position 1, and all will be fine.
All will be fine with a change of strat position for Carlos Sainz as he goes fastest of anybody in the first sector. just making his way through the left-hander of turn 5, which brings you downhill into the middle sector of this lap. In terms of times, it's George Russell in the Mercedes, currently fastest, a 1:15.8 to his name. Then it's Verstappen, Perez, Leclerc, Hamilton in 5th, ahead of Ocon and Tsunoda. Stroll, Sainz and Albon round out the top 10. Joe is 11th in front of Ricciardo. The two Hasses of Magnussen and Ollie Behrman, who is in for an FP1 running in place of Nico Hülkenberg, down in 14th, ahead of Bottas. Still no times, though, from Alonso, Norris, Piastri, Gasly and Sargent. They've all been out at least once, but haven't set a competitive lap time just yet. And Sainz, having complained with P issues, now crosses the line on the hard compound of tyre, goes second fastest, a 1:15.8.
And while we're talking about the driver market and Alpine, Harry, I think we should probably mention, shouldn't we, some news that's happened this morning. The extraordinary developments at Alpine over the last year or so have continued with the announcement that Flavio Briatore has come back to that team as an executive consultant with the aim of sort of, being a consultant effectively, helping them sort out their managerial decisions, attract new talent and so on. Why a 74-year-old who's not been in Formula 1 for 15 years and was kicked out because he was caught cheating in the Singapore Grand Prix in 2008, which he denies, by the way, will be helpful to Alpine is a question which we think Bruno Fama, the Renault team principal, will probably be asked in the press conference in a couple of hours' time.
Rather him than anyone else. It is an extraordinary signing, Mark, isn't it? But does it highlight the kind of dire nature Alpine are in at the moment, because they're hemorrhaging people left, right and centre, and there's even talk recently of them getting rid of their Renault engine and then becoming a customer team.
It's a strange situation. I was seeing a lot of comment on social media after that announcement this morning, most of which you could surmise as desperate times call for desperate measures, which is sort of what it feels like, isn't it? Because like Andrew says, I'm not sure what they think that brings to the party. 20 years ago, I appreciate he did some wonderful things with that organisation. They had a lot of success off the back of it. When I was at McLaren back in the mid-2000s, he was one of our main rivals and main competitors, and it was some great battles. And he built a team which, with the hands of Fernando Alonso, had success, won championships. But it's a long time ago, and Formula One has changed a dramatic amount. He's part of the sort of Bernie Ecclestone era of this sport, which, as I said, commendable in many ways, did lots of things, achieved lots of stuff, but the sport's moved on a long way from that now.
I have to say, from an optics point of view, it's obviously not good, to bring someone back who was wrapped up in the Singapore Crashgate controversy. Lots of people will find that a very controversial decision. From the other side of things, it gives the impression of Alpine being a team that are sort of like scratching around trying to find answers for that they don't know at the moment. So, they've lost in the last year a team principal, a sporting director, a technical director, a head of aerodynamics, an operations director, and an engineering consultant, some of whom have gone on to other teams, because many of them are very, very highly respected and regarded people within Formula One. Meanwhile, and preceding all of that, they made an absolute dog's dinner of the driver market in 2022 and lost not only Fernando Alonso but Oscar Piastri as well, through mismanaging their relationships with those two drivers. Laurent Rossi, the CEO of Alpine at the time, lost his job as a result of that, but his boss Luca De Meo is effectively where the buck stops. He's making these decisions. He's the one, he was actually named in the press release this morning about Flavio Briatore. He's brought Briatore back, and he's the one who, it seems, is considering what would be a quite remarkable decision. This is the Works Renault Formula One team. They have a storied history in Formula One. They're famous for the quality of their engines, or at least they used to be. They introduced turbo engines back in Formula One back in 1977. And they're actually seriously considering dropping their engine program and becoming a customer team. I don't know about you, Mark, but the logic of that just escapes me completely.
It seems incredibly odd. I mean, the whole point of them being in Formula One is to promote their brand, isn't it? It's, of course, under the name of Alpine right now, but we all know that's part of this Renault group. So if you're going to commit to a global sport to promote your brand, if you had even some success and won championships, it's going to be with another brand, one of your rivals' engines in the back of that car. That feels like a really odd PR situation to potentially put yourself in. I mean, to sort of slightly balance this decision, particularly the Briatore decision, I would say you might want to look at it and say at least they're trying to do something. At least they're looking for a way out of the situation they're in right now, which is not a good situation. They are right at the back of the Formula One grid as a global car manufacturer. That's not good. That's not a good look. So they're trying to instigate something which might make a change. I commend them for that. I just don't understand the reasoning behind some of these decisions. Hopefully we'll get more explanation and enlightenment as the weeks roll on.
Flavio Briatore, correct me if I'm wrong on this, he is still involved with the management of Fernando Alonso, isn't he? Yeah, so not that really has any bearing, but it's just something interesting to note that he hasn't been completely inactive within Formula One since 2008.
No, quite. And in fact, 2009 was when he got kicked out, because the truth of Singapore 2008 didn't emerge until a year later, basically, on the eve of the race in 2009. He's become more and more a more frequent visitor to the Formula One paddock in the last year or so. I believe he's been doing some commercial work for Formula One. He's popped up in the odd picture of people like Toto Wolff and so on social media, and he has been in Fernando Alonso's management group, basically running it all Alonso's career. He was obviously also involved with Mark Webber and may well still be. So he hasn't, of course he's not been away, but he hasn't been, what I meant earlier was he's not been involved in team management for a very, very long time. And things in Formula One have moved on. And I think the question is really, if he's there to try to attract new talent to Alpine, why do they think that Flavio Briatore is going to be the guy who's going to do that? That's the question I don't really understand.
And that will be the question that many people are asking as well. Hashtag BBCF1. Amit says, can we play out a jingle for Andrew Benson when talking about Alpine so I can briefly switch off? We'll leave it there. We'll leave it there on the Alpine chatter, Amit. We will. We've got producer Paddy working on it right now for you. 42 minutes and 47, 46, 45 seconds remain of free practice one. It's Max Verstappen now fastest to 1:15.4, over 2/10 clear of George Russell in second. Then it's Sainz, Hamilton, Norris in fifth. Perez is sixth in front of Leclerc. Ocon, Tsunoda and Albon make up the top 10. Then it's Piastri in 11th ahead of Stroll, Joe, Ricciardo, Behrman in 15th ahead of Magnussen in 16th. Then it's Sargent, Bottas. Still no times on the board though for Fernando Alonso in the Aston Martin and Pierre Gasly in the Alpine. They have been out. It says they've done 4 laps apiece, but no competitive lap times from them or Valtteri Bottas as well. So they're currently the bottom 3 runs as the Ferrari of Charles Leclerc dips a wheel onto the gravel and almost loses the rear end.
So what, let's just hear from Perez.
Is there anything wrong with the throttle pedal that we are understeering too much? Corner exits.
Like I said, we'll have a talk in the garage.
So what Perez is talking about there, he's not actually talking about the physical throttle pedal, the one that's under his foot. He's talking about the response that he gets from the engine when he presses that pedal. So i.e. how does the power delivery come in when he activates the throttle? And that's something that's completely controllable by the engineers. You can remap that and change that torque curve however you want it to play, which will in turn affect things like understeer. That's what he's on about there. What was I about to say, Harry? What was I about to tell you with absolute gem of wisdom?
Was it on the Ferrari nearly spitting out?
Oh, no, it was
it the drivers not going out?
Yeah,
the laps.
The lack of lap times for the guys at the back. Effectively, on a Friday, you often get teams just doing installation laps, so going out the pits, not going past the timing beacon at the start line, and coming back into the pits. Particularly with aero rakes on the back of the car, you might just want to get a straight line run down the back straight and see what it gives you.
The guy is horrendous for now.
Okay, we're having a look.
A positive review from Charles Leclerc there. The car is horrendous right now as he makes his way through turn 2, through that long right-hander of turn 3. High G-forces on the driver's neck and body. full throttle through the right-hander. Then it's a slightly downhill braking zone through to turn 4 as it arcs round to the right, briefly heading back uphill before straightening the car up. And actually, he has to have a couple of goes at turning it into the left-hander of turn 5. Then you're heading back downhill, the gravel to driver's right. So easy to get sucked out into the gravel runoff as he then makes his way through turn 7 and 8, where it starts to get a little bit narrow as you head back uphill through the right-hander of turn 9. And then a dose of DRS down the back straight into the braking zone for the left-hander of turn M, which was widened a few years ago, so the MotoGP riders could also enjoy this circuit. And then gets a little bit nervous, this Ferrari, coming under braking through the corners. You can kind of see, can't you, Mark, why he was calling it horrendous. He doesn't look confident in this car right now, Charles Leclerc.
No, a lot of understeer, very twitchy, having to be really kind of patient and hesitant to get on the throttle coming out of the long right-hander. Of course, this circuit was changed in recent years, wasn't it, last year, to avoid that almost like a chicane, 2 very slow corners at the end of the lap. They've gone back to what was actually the original configuration now, with a very long, fast, sweeping right-hander leading onto the start-finish straight. So we talked about this right at the beginning. It used to be a real mix of slow and fast corners, this. It's actually now shifted a bit more towards just the medium and high speed stuff, which really means you've got to rely on the car's aerodynamics to keep the grip level up so that you can apply throttle and get on the throttle early. And it looks to me from that Ferrari onboard shot that we just had the privilege of watching that he hasn't got that. He hasn't got the stability and the grip to be able to really bury the throttle, which is where he needs to be.
There's the sound of Lando Norris in the McLaren coming through the right-hander of turn 12, and then just actually runs out onto the gravel a little bit. Let's see what he says.
Just instability into most corners. Pretty poor grip from the rear. And as soon as I have entry and stability, the whole corner's pretty much gone.
It was actually almost identical, wasn't it, to the Ferrari? So I wonder if it's a wind issue. I wonder if there's a change of wind direction there, which is really hampering those cars, because they both had, it was the same corner. Those comments you just heard Lando Norris talking about were actually very similar to what we saw when we went on board with the Ferrari.
Well, the conditions are quite nice, much nicer than they were yesterday, with rain pouring down in the pit lane. Blue skies, white puffy clouds, sunshine overlooking the Circuit de Barcelona Catalunya. Air temperature 28.4 degrees, track temperature just over 46 degrees as well. And we mentioned, this is a track that often you see a lot of upgrades, and we have indeed got some. Red Bull bringing quite a few: side pod, engine cover, floor, beam wing, rear wing. Ferrari also with upgrades, so perhaps those are just bedding in and getting tested to the limit through the 2 Ferrari drivers at the moment. For rear wing, engine cover, floor, diffuser, so there's some updates to the halo as well. Aston Martin front suspension and rear corner. RB with quite a bit of floor, bodywork, rear wing, engine cover. Sauber, rear wing, front corner, and Haas as well with a little upgrade to the rear. Nothing though from Williams, Alpine, McLaren or Mercedes. Mark, George Russell currently sitting pretty in second, about a 10th behind Max Verstappen, who is currently fastest in this session for Red Bull. Off the back of a dead heat of a pole in Canada. It was Russell who set the lap time first, so he started on pole position. Couldn't convert it into the win in what was a tricky race for all involved. But I suppose it seems like we've had plenty of false dawn before with Mercedes in the last couple of years, but this one does feel a little bit different. Ever since this introduction of a new front wing, they're not pinning all their hopes on that new front wing, but it just seems they've perhaps finally got a bit of a clearer understanding of these regulations now we're a couple of years in.
Yeah, it sounds like that, doesn't it? From the sort of messaging coming out of the team, it really feels like something's clicked, and even if it's just an understanding of where they went wrong, it gives them a direction in which they can start to move. Canada, Montreal was actually, yes, he couldn't convert that into the win, but perhaps he should have done. At times they had the fastest car of anybody, didn't they? He had an opportunity, at least in the hands of George Russell, to win that race. So they were contenders, but you've got to think about the reason that a lot of people bring upgrades to this particular race is that it is, a much more of an aerodynamic circuit, which we've talked about. Think about recent races. We've had Monaco, incredibly slow corners, nothing to do with high speed. Montreal, also very, very low corner average. We come here and it's almost the opposite. So from a driver's perspective and from a team's perspective, these cars are almost nothing like what we've seen in the last couple of rounds. I'm sure from a driver's perspective, they must feel completely different to the cars they drove last time out. And we won't necessarily get the same form that we saw in Canada translate over to here. We are seeing a lot of upgrades. Most of those are kind of edged towards improving the aerodynamic performance on a track like this, and this first session is where the teams, as much as we are getting that very first look at exactly what they're doing for each of them.
You bring up a good point about George Russell, though. Look, he is blindingly fast. There is no question about that. You don't get to his level, you don't be a race winner in Formula One without being exceptional. But is there a question to be asked, perhaps, is he a bit too mistake prone when the pressure is applied?
So he was actually talking about this yesterday, and he was basically saying what had been my impression of what was going on in Canada, that partly anyway, I felt that he was kind of, it's been so long since he had a chance to win. He finally had one, and I felt it felt like he was overreaching a bit, you know. And what he said yesterday was that he was driving absolutely on the limit because he sensed the victory might be on. And he said if the car was more competitive, then I wouldn't have to push quite so hard to try and keep it in that place, but I'd rather be doing that than, you know, backing it off and driving like 1 or 2% less. But if you drive 1 or 2% less, you're not in the lead fight anymore. That's basically what he was saying. So it's basically backing up what our impression had been a couple of weeks ago. And you can understand where he's coming from, you know. What we don't know is, and that's basically been the situation at Mercedes for the last couple of years. There's been a couple of races where he has made errors when he's been chasing for the lead. Singapore last year, for example, he crashed on the last lap. Las Vegas last year, he crashed with Max Verstappen. But it's also worth saying that in Brazil in 2022, he was utterly composed and brilliant on his way to what has been Mercedes' only victory since 2021, basically. So I think in that context, I think it will be pretty harsh to draw the conclusion that some people have drawn, which is that he is naturally inclined to make errors when he's battling at the front.
I couldn't agree more. I'm a big fan of George Russell. I think he's an immensely talented driver, and I think all of those examples that Andrew's just mentioned there, where we've seen him make mistakes, they've been exactly what we talked about. They are that rare occasion in an era for Mercedes which hasn't been dominant. They're a rare occasion when an opportunity has presented itself. You think about Canada, I don't think even Mercedes expected to be where they were in the pecking order at that Grand Prix. So when the opportunity pops up and you suddenly see there's a chance that you might be able to get a win or a really strong result, I'm here for that. Go for it. Give it everything. And even if it means tiptoeing over the edge on occasion, making the odd mistake, I want to see a driver going for that chance when it turns up.
I think what's interesting about Canada is that Norris and Verstappen both said that the Mercedes was the fastest car. I actually think they're wrong. It was the fastest car in qualifying. I don't think it was the fastest car in the race. I think the McLaren was potentially the fastest car in the race, and the Red Bull, Verstappen looked very controlled whenever he got in the lead, and he always looked very comfortable when he wasn't in the lead, when he was following somebody. Whereas Russell didn't look comfortable. In fact, he went off, in fact, trying to chase Verstappen back down again. That was one of the three big mistakes he made when he went off at turns 8 and 9, and that was basically the end of his victory chances. So I don't think, on the evidence of Russell's race, you can justifiably argue that the Mercedes was the fastest car on the track in Canada. What you can say is it's the first race this year when it's been pretty much close to properly competitive. He saw that and was just trying his utmost, basically, and he went over the edge, and he admitted it. He's not very happy with himself, you know. I think he's had a bit of soul searching from what he was saying yesterday over the last couple of weeks about that, but that's not necessarily the same as regret. I mean, he will regret the mistakes, but he doesn't regret the approach he was taking, he said.
No, not at all. I mean, and let's look at the stats as well when you compare him to Lewis Hamilton this year so far, qualifying, 8-1 in Russell's favour. When it comes to the race, it's 7-2 in Russell's favour. if he is going to have these soul-searching moments, I suppose it's almost better to do that this year ahead of next year when he really has to step up into that team leader role, especially if he's got this fast young charger who everyone is touting as a future world champion in Kimi Antonelli alongside him.
Yeah, 100%. This is part of that process, isn't it? To becoming that driver, you've got to go through this. The one thing I'd say about Canada is, and one of the reasons it was such a spectacular event, is that conditions were so changeable that I actually think we had 2 or even 3 cars that at different times in the race were the quickest. So the conditions shifted to mean that certain cars and their characteristics, together with the drivers behind the wheel, were able to excel at different times in the race, and that's what made it so great.
It's also worth pointing out that all the drivers made mistakes. Verstappen went off at turns 1 and 2. It didn't do much harm, but he got it back together again, but he did go off. Norris made a mistake. So it wasn't just Russell, it's just that Russell did make 3 quite high-profile ones that affected his race, but one of Norris's mistakes also affected Russell's race, because he went off at turn 1, rejoined the track and sort of held Russell up when he was trying to chase down Verstappen, and that was all in that phase of the race when Russell was trying to close back on Verstappen, and that was the same phase of the race where he went off at turns 8 and 9. So I think we've explored it.
Yeah, and as we mentioned, Russell, he goes fastest with a 1:14.7 on the medium compounder tyre. Sainz, though, also going quick on the medium tyre when he comes across the line, and he goes quicker by over a tenth. It's Sainz, Russell, Verstappen, who is now out there on track. He's just stuck the soft compound tyre on, so expect Verstappen to have a pretty pacey lap next time he comes back around. Lewis Hamilton also on a quick lap, fastest of anybody in the first sector, quicker than Sainz as well in the middle sector, but he runs wide through the left-hander of turn 10, just gets a little bit deep on the brakes. Perez on the soft tyre goes second fastest, can't quite match or even beat the Ferrari time on the medium tyre. Pirelli bringing the hardest compounds in the range this weekend. This is Hamilton to the line, 4th fastest for the Brit, who has won 6 times around this track. And let's just see where Verstappen comes across on the soft. He's fastest of anybody in the middle sector, to the line for Max Verstappen, and it's fastest by over 0.3 of a second. Verstappen, Sainz, Perez, Russell, Hamilton, the top 5 with 28 minutes and 22 seconds remaining.
So this is a circuit that, for all of its aerodynamic characteristics and demands that we've seen, also is a circuit that doesn't necessarily have the features that we've seen hampering Red Bull over the last couple of rounds. You don't need to crash across curbs. It's a relatively smooth circuit. It's much more, as we said, aerodynamically focused, and that really is where the strengths of the Red Bull have always shown, have been one of their high points. So we would expect Red Bull to very much be back on terms here. The big question is anybody, having made their progress that we've seen in recent times, with Ferrari and McLaren particularly, have they got close enough to make this a real fight?
Well, that's hopefully what we'll find out after these practice sessions and into qualifying as well, in what is, we discussed, a more traditional circuit where we can see the truer pecking order. Daniel Ricciardo in the RB is just making his way to the line now, off the back of a pretty decent Canadian Grand Prix run out for the Aussie. Finished up in 8th position. Perhaps if his teammate Yuki Tsunoda hadn't have spun out in the closing laps, he would have been behind his teammate Tsunoda, who was also behind in qualifying as well. But that was a race Ricciardo needed, wasn't it? But he's had, I'll go back to Miami, where he had a spectacular 4th on the grid for the sprint. It was a flash, a brilliant flash. He's still got the speed, but it's the consistency.
Yeah, he came under a bit of pressure, didn't he, in Canada? Jacques Villeneuve being fairly brutal with some comments early in the weekend about not just his current form, but his actual whole career. Many of which I'm sure fans at home might have said, well, I've been thinking that as well, but I thought he went a little bit far personally. But he was questioning whether he deserved a place on the grid, and this is a question that Red Bull are having to ponder now very seriously, because his results have not been consistent enough. And I guess the bigger question is, how many opportunities, how much of a chance do you give somebody when there is a roster of young talent knocking on the door of Formula One? And that's a decision that Red Bull, via their RB team, are going to have to make in the coming weeks. It's a tough one.
I don't know what Tsunoda was doing there. I pulled to the right and he just aimed for me.
That's George Russell on the radio. This is on the straight that runs down from turn 9 to 10 with Tsunoda flashing by him.
We've got some just a little interesting point of note. The technical delegate has just revealed the new power unit components for this weekend. And if you remember, Max Verstappen had an engine problem recently, which required a change. And he implied at the time that he might be getting a penalty down the line. Well, he's not getting one yet, but he has taken a new internal combustion engine this weekend, Max Verstappen, and a new turbocharger, and a new MGU-H and MGU-K, and each one of those is his fourth, and you're only allowed 4 before you get a penalty, and we're only halfway through the season. So I think it's pretty certain from that we can conclude that Max Verstappen will get an engine-related grid penalty in the not too distant future, certainly in the second part of the season.
Teams do start to look at this, of course, strategically now, don't they? So if you know you're going to have to introduce a new component, even if you're the likes of Red Bull, you're going to be looking at the circuits, and they've got a very clear picture now of which circuits favour them, which don't. They're going to be looking at the circuits that might be more of a challenge. So they may be looking at Singapore further down the line as another opportunity, rather, to bring in, if they have to, a 5th component which might bring the penalty. They'd rather take a penalty at a racetrack that's perhaps already going to be a struggle for them, rather than somewhere like here where they very much expect to do well.
24 minutes, 20, 19, 18 seconds remain of free practice 1. It's Verstappen who tops the times with a 1:14.2 on the soft tyre, ahead of Carlos Sainz on the medium in the Ferrari. Then it's Perez in 3rd, Russell, Hamilton in 5th, Albon up into 6th, ahead of Ricciardo, Sargent, Joe and Behrman on the soft compound tyre. Was 10th, now 11th, because Lando Norris has just gone fastest with a 1:14.2, less than half a tenth of a second between himself and Max Verstappen. Lando Norris, the only driver now to finish in the points in every race so far this season. So Mr. Consistency, and it's showing in the driver standings as well, with 3rd and just 7 points behind Charles Leclerc in the Ferrari. So Leclerc really taking a big hit with no points scored last time around in Canada. We have got a new addition on the grid for FP1. We've seen him before, Ollie Behrman, the 19-year-old Essex boy from part of the Ferrari Driver Academy. As we're just seeing, there's a bit of debris on the just slightly off the racing line, but it's on the run down from turn 9 to 10. So I wonder if they might call some sort of maybe even a red flag or a VSC to try and remove that.
It's a very, very fast corner, turn 9. Campster it's called. It's the uphill right-hander, which is very nearly flat out, and it is, as you say, Harry, it's just off the racing line on the exit of the corner, but it's only just off the racing line, and they're still in the corner phase at that point. So I think they will probably have to do something about that bit of debris, which I can't tell what it is. A bit of a front wing by the looks. I'm
surprised there's not even a bit of a yellow flag out covering that, as the RB comes shooting by Daniel Ricciardo as it blows in the wind. And we're just about to see has it come off the Aston Martin. So it's Fernando Alonso who's come through the fast right-hander, gone off onto the red and white rumble strip on the exit, and then just looks like something has fallen off as he has gone off.
Yeah, exit curve in turn 9. There was something flying out of the front wind, so better to check.
I think it also hit the halo as well as soon as it came off from the front wing, a bit of the end plate or the underside of the front wing, and that has indeed brought out a red flag. So a marshal or two will make their way onto the track once all the cars have come back into the pits to remove that. So Fernando Alonso then losing a little bit of his front wing. 2-time winner around this track, his last win coming at this circuit 185 Grand Prix ago, since Spain in 2013. Red flag out then, and it's practice because the clock continues to count down. I was on Behrman, wasn't I? The Ferrari Driver Academy member, surely a shoe-in for a Haas seat next year. This is his second, I believe, of 6 free practice 1 appearances he's got lined up for Haas. Of course, he made his Grand Prix debut this year in place of the injured Carlos Sainz back in Saudi Arabia, and finished 7th in that race. He's actually still 12th in the Drivers' Championship, is Ollie Bearman. The F2 season not going his way, but there's lots of various factors at play because of that. And right now, he's about 1.6 seconds off the pace. Magnussen 1.4 seconds off the pace, and those were their first runs on the soft compounder tyre, so a couple of tenths in it. Bearman, surely a shoo-in.
Yeah, the clear advantage he's got is that everyone's seen him in a race weekend situation, and that makes a huge difference. For all the other young drivers, yeah, you might get the opportunity to get an FP1 outing, and that's valuable because you get to work with a team, they get to work with you, but it's not the same as going through a race weekend, which is what he's done, and he came through that, with a glowing review from almost everybody that watched it. So yeah, that puts him in a very good place. Of course, the Haas team heavily linked with Ferrari. They take, of course, their power unit and other components, so it does feel like it's an obvious move. 2 seats available at that team, it feels like it's an absolute shoe-in. Yeah.
Would you keep K-Mag alongside for the consistency and the experience he brings, or would you bring in a Bottas or an Ocon?
I think that's a difficult call between those few drivers you just mentioned there. Of course, Bottas has some wonderful experience, and particularly experience at a real top team during successful times. That counts for a lot. But I actually am a fan of Magnussen. I know that he can be chaotic. I know that he can sometimes feel like he steps over the edge, but I think he's an exciting driver. He's vastly experienced, but importantly, he's got experience with that team. I know that from changing both of your drivers in any given season can be very difficult. You're learning how to work with these people who are key members of the organisation. You're learning how to build relationships at a time, when you're supposed to be on track delivering results. So to have at least one side of your garage as a consistent part of that team is really important, so I'd keep Magnussen.
Well, and of course Haas had that very experience when they put Mick Schumacher and Nikita Mazepin in the car, 2 rookies. They got rid of Romain Grosjean and Kevin Magnussen. They wanted some money, and they wanted thought maybe we go for a new completely green lineup, and it didn't pay off. So you'd have to think, okay, Bearman has more pedigree, but 2 people not experienced with the team.
You think about the last time we did it, 2007. Well, it was Fernando Alonso and Lewis Hamilton. They weren't necessarily both rookies, but it ended in utter disaster.
I think they had the calibre as well. Session back underway then. We've removed the bit of front wing that was broken off Fernando Alonso's Aston Martin just on the exit of turn 9. So green flag running, and they all file out of the pits. 18 minutes and 20 seconds remain.
What you're basically asking there, Harry, is out of the drivers who are still available, so basically we're talking about Magnussen, Bottas, Ocon, those are the 3.
I also hear Joe, because he's got a big lump of cash behind him.
Let me ask my question, and you can answer it for me.
Okay.
How do you rank those drivers in order of pace and general competitiveness? Bottas, Magnussen, Ocon.
But that's not the only factor, as we just said.
Okay, but let's just put money. None of those 3 bring money. Okay?
So
Bottas, Ocon, Magnussen, those 3. Order, please.
I'd go for Bottas top. I would go for Ocon second and Magnussen third.
That's exactly what I would say as well. So I think K-Mag's got a problem.
So I would say the difference between them in terms of pace, we don't know it because we've never seen them all in the same car at the same time, but secondly, it's not the most important factor. The difference between them must be so close that for me, keeping at least one element of consistency in your team, in your driver lineup going into a new season, is more important than what you might bring fractionally by bringing one of those 2 drivers in.
So I think it's, in this case, I'm not sure that analogy applies, because it's not like you're swapping out a Hülkenberg and a Magnussen for a Schumacher and a Mazepin, who are just not good enough. You're swapping out a Magnussen for someone like Bottas or Ocon or remind me who the other one was.
Well, I said Joe because he's got the money.
Who is a proven quantity. In the case of both of them, the Grand Prix winners, aren't they? So I'm not saying, by the way, that they are definitely better than Magnussen. I'm just saying that I don't see it as a risk in the same way as you're suggesting, because Bottas and Ocon are already proven. I don't think you're not necessarily taking a risk.
But I'm not saying the risk.
A new driver in, because they're not that new, really.
I'm not saying the risk is his driving ability. I'm saying the risk is having to build relationships in the team and having to learn to understand how they work and what motivates them, and all of these different elements that contribute to a successful season. If you have to learn those once the season's getting underway, you're potentially compromising your early rounds.
I suppose if we're also basing it on recent history with Haas, they're looking for somebody who can also be a team player, right? Kevin Magnussen, I don't think you can say this season he has not been a team player. Whether he has wanted to be or not is another question, but he has played the team game, and as a result, he currently sits 2 points away from a one-race ban. But put that aside, you know, if you're okay, you've got speed as one ranking, and then you've got, for a team like Haas, toward the middle towards the back, okay, you want somebody who's going to put the team first. You put Magnussen's got to be on that list. I think you'd take Ocon out of the picture in that occasion, but you'd keep Bottas in play for the pure reasons of when he was alongside Lewis Hamilton.
Well, the other side of this, and just to contradict everything I've just said, is that you're looking at a slightly longer term argument here, because 26, you know, everything about this sport is changing pretty much. So what you do want is a driver pairing that's well established by the time you get there, because, you know, not just does your driver lineup change, but everything changes. You don't want to be changing drivers at that point. And if you've got a Magnussen, he hasn't got a long career ahead of him. He's coming towards the end surely. So at some point, whether it's 26 or 27, you're going to want to start thinking about replacing whoever it is next. So there's an argument to say that the longer term game, you might take a little bit of short term pain in 25 to have a well established and well built team for 26.
172 Grand Prix starts for Kevin Magnussen, 33rd on the all-time list. He's ahead of Stroll and behind Sainz, so a huge vast of experience, and a driver who was also had more than one comeback into Formula One as well. Came back from McLaren, came back from Renault, came back from Haas as well. So 3 times a comeback king for Kevin Magnussen in Formula One. But right now, he's down in 16th. Behrman, who's just come into the pits, down in 18th. It's Lando Norris fastest at the moment, 1:14.2. Verstappen second, Sainz third. Then it's Russell. Perez is fifth, ahead of Piastri. Hamilton, Ocon is 8th. Alonso, Albon round out the top 10. Then it's Leclerc, who has been struggling all session long so far with his Ferrari, which does have upgrades on. He's down in 11th, ahead of Bottas. Then it's Gasly, Stroll. Ricciardo is 15th, ahead of Joe. Here is Leclerc.
Who is the Aston Martin?
Around you, or before Stroll?
Wow, just in the middle of the corner as always.
Yeah, that was Stroll. That was coming through the left-hand kink of 11 before you loop back round on yourself through the right-hander of 12. Joe is 16th, ahead of Magnussen, Sargent, Behrman and Tsunoda, down in 20th and last.
Yeah, it was quite a high-speed section that Charles Leclerc almost tripped over the Aston Martin, so I can understand his frustration. It's not going smoothly yet for Leclerc, is it? I don't know, you've got your list there. Have both Ferraris got the upgrades, do you know?
Well, that's a very good point, actually. It doesn't actually specify. Okay. It only says Ferrari have brought these upgrades, so because we'll try and clarify that.
The point is, when you bring upgrades, very rarely actually do you just take them out of the box, bolt them on the car, and it suddenly just works. If that happens, you know, it's the holy grail. That's amazing. But in reality, what's more likely to happen is you bolt them on the car, you figure out how it behaves. It's often not quite to your liking, and then you have to make tweaks and changes to the setup to bring the car back into the window where these new upgrades can be maximised. So that's what FP1 and FP2 is all about. So the fact that Leclerc currently down in 11th, 1.2 seconds off the pace, it's not something that should be too alarming at this point.
No, and when you see Carlos Sainz up in third, a man who has scored points here in his last 9 appearances, never stood on the podium in his home race, and I suppose the pressure will be on him if he does indeed have to take a seat that sees him fall out of a team, a car that is a regular podium contender. Perhaps the last chance he'll have for a little while of being on the podium in front of his home fans. Carlos Sainz, born in Madrid, so he'll have an even closer home race in a couple of years for the 29-year-old Carlos Sainz. Perez currently down in 5th, about 4/10 off his teammate Verstappen, both on the soft compound tyre. Worth remembering that Perez comes into this race off the back of a 3-place grid penalty as well. So he'll have a mission on his hands anyway, no matter where he qualifies. And I know we have this conversation all the time, but it's because he's in a Red Bull and his teammate is Max Verstappen. This is Perez in another one of his ruts. Here's Leclerc first.
Strength with the clutch when I came in. I kept the clutch and the rear tires locked up completely, and then went again when I was stopping for the box now.
Copy.
So that sounds like, don't forget, the rear braking system is a brake-by-wire system on these cars, much more likely to be something electronic going on in terms of when he's pulled the clutch in, the delivery of the braking torque through the rear wheels by the electric motor, of course, is not quite optimal. Perez, it's a difficult one. He's just signed a new deal at Red Bull, which takes him certainly through 2025. It was a little bit unclear, and I think very carefully worded, the way the press release by Red Bull announced his deal, talking about keeping him there until 26, but not till the end of 26, which I thought was fairly interesting. I suspect, Red Bull, they want him there for next year. Let's hear from Russell.
Why have you put it on track over the next endpoint?
It's a good question.
He wants the answer to that question. There you go. He's asking why he's next to his teammate on track, I think, which is an odd one.
Well, they actually came together in qualifying last year in Barcelona because they were so close to each other on the track.
Yeah,
a bit of front wing damage for Russell in the end.
So one of them towing the other one down the main straight, which the other one feeling is a little bit unfair. But yeah, Perez, he signed this deal, so Red Bull do want to keep the consistency for 2025. A large part of that, as we touched on earlier, is to keep Max Verstappen and the Max Verstappen camp happy. He is their main point of focus. He's the one that's going to bring them almost all of their results. We're seeing that year on, year out. So they need to keep that happy, because if it's Max Verstappen, you've lost your biggest secret weapon. They've already lost Adrian Newey, which might be another part to that. That's gone. You've got to keep Max Verstappen, otherwise it's not what have you got left, because they've got a great team of people around that, but they haven't got the big superstars outside of that to sort of really pin their hopes on. Perez isn't one of those big superstars. So for 2026, it's all to play at Red Bull for, because we still don't know if Max Verstappen will be there. And if Max isn't there in 26, Red Bull have an enormous problem on their hands. They've got to find a driver from somewhere to take their prime seat in a year where everything changes. And that's not easy, because everyone else is going to be sewn up by that point. So they've got to keep Max Verstappen happy somehow. The best way to do that is by keep giving him the quickest car, because that's what he wants more than anything else. But for 26, that's still a relative unknown.
But also, the idea of a number 2 driver isn't something new, especially within Red Bull. But you go back to, Michael Schumacher with Rubens Barrichello in the second seat, or Lewis Hamilton in more recent years, and whoever is Fernando Alonso's teammate. The problem is, I think Andrew mentioned this on the Checkered Flag podcast previewing this weekend, which you can have a little listen to on the BBC Sounds app in between sessions, is that the problem that Red Bull have now is the margins appearingly seem so much smaller now, that a couple of tenths, 3 to 4 tenths, which maybe Perez is kind of averaging out being off the pace compared to Verstappen, is now converting into 5, 6, 7 positions lost.
Yeah, it's true. And if you're going to employ a number 1, number 2 driver model, your number 2 driver has to be right there behind your number 1 driver. Otherwise, the whole system sort of falls apart. If you put all your eggs in one basket and you sort of forget about your other driver and he ends up halfway down the grid, you'll get exactly what's happening right now, is that other teams who have 2 drivers scoring, I'm looking at McLaren, I'm looking at Ferrari, they're coming for you, and there's no guarantees, even with the dominant start that Red Bull had to this year, they will win this Constructors' Championship, and it'll be for that reason if it doesn't happen.
Well, Perez has slipped down to 5th in the Drivers' Championship off the back of 2 retirements as well. Monaco, which was a disaster. Canada as well, which is the way he retired as well. Continuing back to the pits with such a damaged car was deemed by the FIA to be unsafe and against the rules, so that's why he has the 3-place grid penalty. I mean, his last podium, you have to go back all the way to a full Grand Prix. It was back in China. He got 3rd in the Miami Sprint, but for an outright podium in a Grand Prix, you're going all the way back there, which is unfortunately a case that seems to be recurring every year around that time, around the Miami time. Then he just seems to fall off the cliff. We want him there, we want him to be there, and he's got pressure from us, from the media, from the team, I'm sure, but I suppose he has the reassurance, at least from Red Bull, with the contract extension.
Yeah, I think something wrong with the car. Box can't drivable.
That's Pierre Gasly on the radio in the Alpine, saying he has got something wrong. Where is Gasly? He's just coming into the pits now. He's 13th fastest. His teammate is up in 8th, Esteban Ocon, off the back of double points finish for Alpine in Canada, which I think, well, I don't want to say lucked into it because it was a tough race and they stayed in the game to the very end, but they were certainly helped by the likes of Alex Albon getting collected for the Ferrari of Carlos Sainz, and I think Haas also missed out on points with Kevin Magnussen with a slow pit stop too. So, but that's racing, isn't it? So Alpine off the back of double points sees them go ahead of Williams again in the Constructors' Championship for 8th place, but Pierre Gasly with problems being wheeled back into the garage. Alpine haven't registered any upgrades this weekend, so hoping to get those recovered. And well, we've talked already a lot about the wider problems with Alpine that are going on there at the moment. Their worst year, well, for Team Enstone, you've got to go back to Tolman back in 1985 because they haven't yet registered a top 8 finish.
Is this worse than 2001?
So the statistic I saw,
I think, was the worst.
Well, the statistic I saw was this was their worst because they haven't. They've always finished at least in the top 8 position at this point of the year, and that hasn't been achieved yet. So therefore, I got it back to the Tolman days, looking at sort of Team Enstone as a wider. We'll double check it in between FP1 and FP2, but that's what I got.
You of course get points for a lot further down now than you used to.
True.
So that might be a big part of it.
True. I'll do a bit of research in the mid-break and figure out. 4.5 minutes remain of free practice 1. It's Norris sitting pretty still at the top, a 1:14.2. Less than half a tenth of a second between him and Max Verstappen. Carlos Sainz 3rd. Russell Perez down in 5th, with one driver missing in the form of Nico Hülkenberg. He's sitting out this session in the Haas for the young Ollie Bearman, who is currently racing in Formula 2 off the back of actually his best results in Formula 2, 4th last time out in Monaco. So they're also in action. But Ollie Bearman is currently 19th, a couple of tenths slower than his teammate Magnussen up in 17th. That's the sound of Charles Leclerc, tentatively making his way through turns 1 and 2. And he's not been too comfortable so far this session. Well,
it might be because he doesn't have the full upgrade package. I've just been talking to Ferrari. They're estimable. Here we are. Some radio for Verstappen.
That game's anti-stalling.
Understood.
And they tell me that only Sainz's car has the full package. At the moment, Leclerc only has the rear wing and some of the bits close to the halo. So not the major bits, the floor, that area around there. So that might explain why he's not happy, but also certainly will explain why he's not as quick as Carlos Sainz, you would imagine.
It was here last year, wasn't it, that Leclerc had a shocker of a weekend. He was not happy with the car, was sliding all over the place. Qualifying was tough for him. So hoping that if they're doing a bit of a back-to-back, that clearly the upgrades seem to be working well on Carlos Sainz's car. He's currently in 3rd. Leclerc down in 11th. He's got a 1:15.4 to his name, whereas Sainz is a 1:14.5, so almost a second in it.
Just saw a replay of Max Verstappen pulling one of his visor tear-offs, that they have multiple layers on their helmet visor, so that when they get peppered with flies and bits of tyre rubber, they can just peel one away, and at that point they have to discard it. Now he's reached up as far as he can to make sure that it doesn't get dragged into one of the radiator ducts or the overhead air intake, and he has managed to avoid all those, but it then got caught on the rear wing and it's been flapping around on the upper element of the rear wing. It's just managed to dislodge itself. But even little things like that, a little piece of plastic fluttering around, will really destabilise how the airflow remains attached to that important rear wing as it goes around a lap.
2 minutes to go, less than that. of FP1. We'll be back later for free practice 2. You can listen to that on the BBC Sports app and website. That will be online only. We'll be on air just before 4 o'clock this afternoon, with the session getting underway at 4 o'clock too. And of course, plenty of Euros action continuing on 5 Live later this afternoon and into the evening. 1 o'clock, we've got build up to Slovakia, Ukraine. Then 5 o'clock, Poland, Australia, and 7 o'clock, the final game of the day, Netherlands take on France on 5 Live. You can hear all of the Euros action live on BBC Radio 5 Live. Right now, though, you're listening to Formula 1 with a minute to go of free practice 1. Norris currently has the fastest lap.
Autocorrects, bane of your life, right? So Esteban Ocon has just been autocorrected by my computer to Eastern Icon.
That's a good one. That's a good one.
It's not the nickname he's used to, but have we got to that part of FP1 already? Look forward to reading your FP1 report, Andrew. The Eastern Icon currently down in 8th, about 0.8 of a second off the fastest lap times at the moment. Of course, there was a bit of trouble once again between the two Alpine drivers at the end of the Canadian Grand Prix. Ocon was actually ahead of Pierre Gasly, was then asked to let Gasly through to try and chase down the driver in front, which I believe was Daniel Ricciardo. And Ocon eventually did get out of the way, but it was too late in the day.
It makes me laugh. Whenever he apologises, makes an excuse for, explains his reaction in these situations, Ocon always says, I've always followed team orders. And the whole point in Monaco, and the reason he got a dressing down from the team, was because he didn't follow team orders. That was literally what it was about. They asked him to hold station behind Gasly before the race a number of times, I'm told, and he'd done exactly the opposite and tried to overtake him on the first lap. So how he can stand there and say, I've always followed team orders, is beyond me. Anyway.
The Eastern Icon does it again.
Unfortunately, you often get these kind of things happening, particularly after a driver's... It's been announced that driver is no longer going to be retained, which of course is the case with Ocon at Alpine. In Montreal, he did eventually let Gasly pass and follow these team orders, but it was only after about a lap and a half's worth of arguing over it. So by that point, it was too late for Gasly to have any attempt on Daniel Ricciardo. And these kind of little murmurings and rumblings won't be easily repaired. The relationship is not in a great place, at least it seems. And with him being, released from his tenure at the team at the end of this season, there's nothing really to sort of suggest that relationship will repair itself.
No, and that's put Gasly ahead of Ocon now in the Drivers' Championship. I mean, we're fighting over nothing here, but it's 15th now for Gasly, 17th for Ocon, with Alex Albon in the middle of that Alpine sandwich. Although both Alpine drivers were at the 24-hour Le Mans last weekend, because Alpine have a hypercar team there, and they're both laughing, smiling, cheering on the team. Mick Schumacher, of course, drives for Alpine in the World Endurance Championship. It was a bit of a tough 24 hours for them, though. They didn't make it all the way to the end. I'll tell you who did, though. Ferrari, who become the first constructor to win the 24 Hours of Le Mans and the Monaco Grand Prix in the same year, in something like 90 years since Alfa Romeo. So Ferrari are sky high right now with their on-track actions.
Good stat.
It is. You're welcome. You're welcome. That's the end of the session, by the way. Lando Norris ended up fastest with a 1:14.228 to his name for the McLaren, ahead of Max Verstappen, but less than half a tenth of a second between those two. Sainz was third, Russell fourth, Perez the top five. Then it was Piastri in sixth, Hamilton seventh, Ocon eighth, Alonso and Albon rounding out the top 10. Charles Leclerc doesn't have the full upgrade on that Ferrari and struggling out there in 11th ahead of Bottas. Gasly, Stroll, Ricciardo 15th ahead of Joe. Magnussen, Sargent was 18th ahead of FP1's Ollie Behrman. Nico Hülkenberg will be back in the car for FP2. And Yuki Tsunoda with a tough start to this Spanish Grand Prix weekend, down in 20th and last. So that's how it ended. So Mark, is that advantage McLaren?
It's definitely too early to say, but it's encouraging. That's what I would say. When you get to a circuit like this that's so different to where we've been in recent weeks, you want to see a car performing well out the box. That's what Norris and Verstappen have both got, well, at least the early signs point towards, so that's good for us.
Yeah, and Verstappen, though, well and truly in the hunt. Let's see if Ferrari do bring more of the upgrade to Charles Leclerc's car from FP2 and see where that leaves the two Ferrari drivers. George Russell also in the mix as well. I tell you what, Fernando Alonso, though, finished the session in 9th, and you have to say, I mean, Alonso and Aston Martin double points last time out as well, but it does seem like Aston Martin have just taken is it fair to say they've taken a bit of a step back in the last few races, or have expectations been exceeded because of how well they began last year?
And also how well other teams around them have done. It feels like they've stagnated more than taken a step backwards, but that's what happens in Formula One. If you stand still, you get left behind, and those around them, you know, some of those teams, particularly the likes of McLaren, Ferrari, even Mercedes, I know they were a little bit ahead already, but we're all talking about them as taking giant leaps. Actually, Aston Martin have got to start looking over their shoulder at who's coming for them from behind.
Absolutely. Well, Fernando Alonso finished that second down in 9th. Lance Stroll finished it down in 14th. Tough days at the office for FP1, at least, for, as I said, Tsunoda. Logan Sargent down there in the Williams as well. Another man fighting to keep his place on the grid for next year, with Williams openly courting other drivers, particularly Carlos Sainz. Zhou Guanyu down in 16th as well. He's actually reverted to an old chassis from the Sauber team due to his rough form in the last few races. So Sauber hoping to find a little something as well as we begin a pretty intense triple header in Formula One. Spain this weekend, then we go to Austria, and then it is the British Grand Prix. But we're only just getting started here in Spain. FP1 done and dusted. We'll be back for FP2 on the BBC Sport website and app from just before 4 o'clock. My thanks to Mark and Andrew. This has been an ING production for BBC Radio 5 Live.